Good evening, commissioners. Good evening, staff, and good evening, public. I'd like to call the October 26th Planning Policy Commission to order, and it is currently 6:33 p.m. Stephen, do we have a quorum this evening?
Chair Voice, you have a quorum tonight.
All right, thank you. Tonight's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The Planning Policy Commission, as you can see, is in person, but staff or members of the public may be attending virtually or in person. Our first item of business tonight is public comment. Stephen, do we have anyone who'd like to make public comment at this time?
Chair Voice, no one has signed up for public comment online, and there is no one in the room.
Great, thank you. All right, moving ahead to our regular business. The first and only item of business tonight is a look at the environmental stewardship and climate resilience element of the comprehensive plan update. This is our first look, and Stephen Padua, our long-range planning manager, will be presenting this evening. So Stephen, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Voice. Good evening, commissioners. Stephen Padua, long-range planning manager, and tonight I'm going to present your one item for tonight, which is the environment stewardship and climate resilience element, which is a brand new element we're introducing for the comprehensive plan periodic update this year. So the question being posed for you tonight is, first, is the proposed element consistent with the land use element goals and policies that have been discussed and that the Commission has reviewed in previous? Then are there additional topics that should be considered for the new element that we can discuss with the Environmental Board and sustainability staff? A little background information. So the environment element is the result of a new bill, House Bill 1181, that requires a new climate resilience element be incorporated into the comprehensive plans. As part of the development of this new element, we're also incorporating environmental stewardship, which is a carryover of a lot of policies from the currently adopted land use element. So essentially, we took the old land use element, split it in half, and a lot of the proposed policies and goals in this new environment stewardship, climate resilience element is carryover of a lot of those goals and policies from the land use element. A lot of the newer goals and policies are I'll discuss in a minute, but it really reflects on the work that went into the climate action plan, which is the primary implementation document for this element. There's also implementation a little more indirectly from the mobility master plan as well as the parks system plan. And then looking operationally through our development regulations also incorporate some of the implementation of environmental policies. We've met with the Environmental Board in a series of meetings this year to kind of cover a lot of what is required for this new element, what's going to be introduced, what do we want to additionally include with the new element as in recognition of some of the carryover goals and policies from the existing land. A lot of the organization listed on the screen deals with a lot of the topics that are covered from what's required from House Bill 1181, but also the carryover goals and policies from the land use element. Recommended changes. As I mentioned, House Bill 1181 really dictated a lot of how we wanted to introduce new goals and policies for the new element, as well as how we structured it. But it also helped us determine how best to navigate these goals and policies as part of the comprehensive plan as it relates to how we're implementing our sustainability and climate resilience goals. The climate resilience goals and policies, there's a lot of new policies introduced with this new element. That's the result of recent efforts to do a vulnerability assessment with our sustainability staff. That was taken on over the past year and then worked with the Environmental Board to refine. The greenhouse gas emissions reduction, some of that is carryover from the land use element. But as part of complying with House Bill 1181, we also moved over some goals and policies from the mobility element or the transportation element to help consolidate where a lot of those greenhouse gas emission reduction policies were going to be located. Natural disasters is also addressed in the element, but at kind of a broader level. recognizing some of the implementation is going to be captured through the implementation of the climate action plan, as well as the city and county and emergency management plans that are currently developed and being updated. Lastly, we also wanted to address environmental justice. Part of the equity lens for the comprehensive plan, but also of what it was being called for out of House Bill 1181. We wanted to make sure that the impacts on overburdened populations is being recognized for this element as well. Timing and next steps. So as we've been discussing with you, we worked through the analysis, we worked through review of a lot of the draft goals and policies. We are continuing the review with the council committee on many of the recommendations from you all, as well as the other boards and commissions. And we're eventually working to first draft development through early next year. So returning to the question, similar to how we presented the other elements last week, we're not really diving into the details of all the specific changes that were discussed with the environmental board, but if you have questions of what was presented in the matrix in your materials tonight, I'm happy to go over that as well.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Commissioner Krass, please.
Thanks. I went through the matrix. Sounds very daunting, the matrix. But one of the things, and when we put goals and policies together, it opens up a question: is what is the role of the city of what they could actually do on some of these things? Because some of them are more aspirational, of which the city doesn't really have control over, like reduce community-wide greenhouse gases. And I wasn't sure if these things should be tailored to the things that the city actually can have impact on, like either lead by example or gate some of these goals to be things that are city-owned buildings and things like that. But when it gets broader, I was having trouble because it may be a goal. When you lump them together, it's something that the city may not have the ability to actually have impact on. I was curious how that would work on that.
So with a lot of the aspirational goals, so some of it is carryover from what was adopted in the climate action plan, and that plan actually does a really good job of breaking out, because it is, you're right, it is much more multifaceted approach to how do you address these aspirational goals. It could be mobility, it could be land use, it could be housing, it could be a lot of different methodologies. Some of it is local and some of it is regional approach in terms of regional collaboration with other agencies and other government staff as we're looking through each of our own local, I guess, goals to at least address a lot of those targets. It's hard to say exactly how we're doing it, but I would say if you wanted to look at what's in the climate action plan, it actually does a really good job of breaking out at least our local versus regional strategies to address them.
I think one example was about sustainable energy, and we don't get a choice of where we get our energy. So it's kind of, I don't know how, it's like we may have, we would want that, but we get it from Puget Sound Energy or whatever, so I don't know how that could be something that we would take as a goal, because we have no control over the supply of the energy, if that makes sense.
We don't have so much, you're correct. We don't have as much control over the supply because PSE or the utility districts and companies have that control. A lot of them have their own climate resilience plans or strategies of how to address climate change. But locally, we can incorporate incentives or regulations for new developments or existing properties to look at moving away from natural gas as a normal use in the household, or maybe more electronic, less use appliances. And so there's a lot of things we can do locally to address it, but you're right, the full control is at the utility.
Commissioner Altamore.
This is more a general question as opposed to the matrix itself, but with some of the legislation that was passed, will there be federal dollars coming down to maybe incentivize some of this work?
Yes and no. So there is going to be state dollars going towards supporting additional analysis. One thing I slipped to mention as part of this, we don't actually have to comply with House Bill 1181 until 2029, because as part of when the bill was introduced, it was based on when everybody's going to be doing their comp plan updates. Because we're doing ours now, we're actually not expected to fully comply until 2029. There's other cities who have already done comp plan updates throughout the state that are going to be required to comply within the next 2 years. We are not one of those cities, but we have actually done a lot of the groundwork to help with complying with the majority of what's being required from House Bill 1181. And so what I'm trying to get at is the state is providing a lot of those funds, prioritizing those cities that are actually required to comply sooner than us. And so we are still applying for some of those funds to help to just continue doing the work that we're doing. But some of that might be prioritized for other cities, and we might get grant funding at a later time.
Commissioner Samweta.
Yes, would there be like credits associated with it where a developer may get like a tax credit or something if they use solar panels for a new development per se?
That could be incentives that we consider of if you install solar panels, maybe we reduce parking reduction as just an example of something that we could do. There's always something you could do with the development regulation to try to incentivize some of these sustainability or climate resilient goals. So those are things that we'll continue to discuss with sustainability staff and our city council as we kind of move for implementation.
Thank you.
And some of those things are already incorporated in our current municipal code in terms of like what's required for new developments, in terms of requiring a certain LEED certification with new major developments of a certain size. Those are already incorporated in our code.
Yes, and can you remind us what LEED certification is required in new buildings in Issaquah?
Oh, I'm going to have to get back to you on the full list of everything that's required with the certification.
Okay. No, I mean like LEED gold, LEED silver.
Right now it's required that new buildings of, I'm forgetting the exact size, it's like 20,000 square feet or larger for commercial, or forgetting the residential unit number, that they have to meet gold LEED certification. I'll confirm going through the code tonight and send you an email.
Okay. Thank you. All right. It doesn't have to be tonight. Thanks.
Vice Chair Bader.
Yeah, I have a comment on each of the questions, so I don't know if I should do both or start with the first one. If we're just kind of viewing right now.
Go for both.
Okay. So it's an overarching comment because I was thinking about like how the goals and policies and the other elements that we reviewed, and I wasn't here at the last meeting, and so I'm not sure what those looked like. But there's a couple policies in here that are written as very specific goals. And so it's reduce fossil fuel use by 20% by X date. And then there's other ones that are like reduce overall building energy use. And so the kind of contrast between those two feels a little like jarring. And I don't see that level of specificity, even though I like that level of specificity in the other elements. And so I don't know if that's like pulled over from somewhere else or why those can be so specific, because I thought the place for that was in like the functional plans and not in here.
So that level of detail is provided at least in this element because it's to ensure that we're consistent with what's in the climate action plan. And so that you're right, it is kind of carry over from that in terms of what council adopted, and we want to make sure our aspirational or at least our primary goals are identified in the comprehensive plan as well as in the functional plans, just so there's consistency. Some of the other elements do have that level of target. There's just not as much compared to this one, because this one, with the climate action plan, it covers a very wide range of sustainability, climate resilience, natural environment, stewardship. There's much more targets related to those comparative to the other elements, but some of the elements do have that level of detail as well.
That is helpful. And then my other comment was that if one of the goals, I guess, or directions is to address environmental justice, that's actually not named anywhere. I did like a search and those words don't show up in the policies. And so should they? And then I also wanted to just get some more insight. Again, it's like a mobility policy, but there was a policy that specifically got to public health, that got to like equitable access and environmental outcomes. That was removed from this element. And so just wanted to get some insight on that.
Some of that because it's addressed in other elements. So there was a lot of overlap between elements that we're trying to fix with this periodic update. And so because it's addressed in other elements and it's not required to be in this one, we're leaving those policies in like the land use element, for instance. The topic of environmental justice is something that we're incorporating in the narrative for this element, not necessarily in the specific policies, just because we call out overburdened populations, or I'm forgetting the other terms. We call out other
Disproportionately
very
impacted,
similar
yeah.
policies that just get at the inequities
Yeah.
that we want to try to address.
And then I had one like really specific random piece of feedback on policy. Oh, it doesn't have a number. It's a new policy under land use LU policy K3, that one. And it's prioritize resilience, planning, education, outreach, and funding for frontline communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change based on research conducted on climate vulnerabilities in Issaquah. That just read like past tense. And so like really random feedback to say like research, like current and future research, so that as new like impacts are identified, that those are just kind of lumped into here. So like really minor feedback, but it read like based on like the status quo now, and not to consider
Which policy was
future
it again?
studies. It doesn't have a number. It's under land use policy K3. It's the one right under that one.
It's page 13 of
Yeah,
21
thank
in our
you.
packet.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we can take a look at that language.
Yeah,
to
I
make
just
sure it's-
felt like current and future research
Yeah.
is like the only minor edit.
Thank you, Vice Chair Bader and Chair Voice. Actually, to build on that, Stephen, I'm just kind of interested, going to that exact policy, so what constitutes a frontline community in Issaquah? This is more just generally for my education. I'll use myself as an example. The traffic on Front Street. I mean, to me, the idling of those cars for 3 to 6 hours a day would be an inequity. Is that how you guys see it? I mean, that's kind of, again, everything sounds good. I guess there's no definition of terms. And I go back to the other one, the equitably advanced programs and policies. Again, I'm just wondering what the city believes overburdened and vulnerable communities. I'm wondering if you could provide an example.
Sure.
Frontline communities.
So we'll think about housing as an example. So historically, cheaper housing has been found closer to freeways. But what we find with it, when thinking about environmental justice or disproportionate impacts, is that when we have located lower income housing closer to freeways, they are disproportionately or higher. There's a higher impact related to air pollution around those communities. And that's found throughout the United States, not necessarily in one area or another. And so you find this pattern of disproportionate impact. And that's just one example of being a frontline community. And that historically has been minority community or low-income community. And so we want to try to address them through different outreach or funding mechanisms or change in regulations in terms of where these types of housing are allowed, something that we're considering as part of this.
Okay, great, thank you. Commissioner Patterson.
I have a couple pieces of minor feedback that kind of resonate based on their comments. One would be on T policy B1. There's an acronym there, SOV, which given its transportation, I took to stand for single occupant vehicle. But I think SOV may not be a universally understood acronym, so maybe one that could be spelled out there.
Yep, we can spell that out.
Cool. And then the other one, kind of back onto that specificity topic, LU policy H1 gets really granular on the neighborhoods, and it looks like they actually added some neighborhoods. Is that, and I think it's related to like mass transit. Is there a reason why it got so granular versus just, I guess, like regional transit or transportation?
It specifically calls out these neighborhoods, Central Issaquah, Issaquah Highlands, Old Town, primarily because that's where our higher density of commercial and retail land uses are located throughout the city.
Gotcha. And is there any reason to keep it more broad, or is it just in case, I guess, like to address it as a city?
Even
plan.
under the consideration with like our neighborhood planning, where we're looking at, when we go out to the neighborhoods to talk about building out neighborhood retail in each of the neighborhoods, it's not going to be at the level of density or any of those uses that's going to warrant building in mass transit to support those areas. It's just not going to get to those levels. So that's primary reason why we focused on those areas, because we know it will get to those densities in those areas to support transit or higher frequency transit as an alternative mode of transportation for those areas.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Commissioner Altamore.
Will there be another comp plan amendment before a light rail gets here?
Yes. The next comp plan amendment will be 2034.
Okay, thank you.
At least the next major periodic update will be 2034. Well, there's still opportunities to do annual updates if we find issues.
Chair Voice, Stephen, on page 7 of 21 on our packet, LU policy F3, I'm sorry. When it states lead by example, implementing actions to track and decarbonize municipal operations, are we talking about the city leading by example, meaning the city of Issaquah with their buildings, their infrastructure? We're not talking about leading by example regionally.
We're talking about the city of Issaquah. So the actual government agency, the city of Issaquah, leading by example, as we're working with private development or even existing commercial or retail businesses that are throughout the city, to just lead by example in terms of what we're wanting for decarbonization.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions on the policies throughout?
I guess I have one more. LU policy G1, decrease energy use, natural gas, and electricity, even though we're moving towards more electricity. Pretty simple question. Is that encouraging people to turn off the lights? Is that talking about rolling brownouts? Is that talking about solar panels? I mean, I always kind of thought electricity is kind of the idea, right? We're trying to electrify things. So when it says decrease energy use and electricity, in my mind, it's, we're asking people to turn off lights, and I can see it in building, and what I thought of like was the dark sky.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to make sure I'm
yes,
clear on that.
It
We're not
is
asking people to turn off their lights for 30% of the day. Well, that's kind of my question. Are we asking people, what are we asking of people when it says that?
It's more efficiency improvements with this policy.
I'm running out of questions here. If anybody has any more for Stephen? Commissioner Altamore.
So when you talk about the efficiency piece, is that mostly what would come under the LEED standards or evergreen standards, so that, LED lighting and water standards and things like that?
Yes, but there's also other incentives in terms of use of the facilities as well, and not just how the facilities are.
Okay, so would that fall under the sustainability office of the
Yes.
city? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Commissioner Kraft.
You made me think about something that was like
Uh-oh.
dangerous. The electricity has two types. You have grid and you have self-supportive. And if someone's creating their own electricity, should we care how much they use or how efficient they are as long as they're not touching the grid? And the answer, I mean, I could argue both sides of the coin on this one, where if I'm producing all my own electricity from my roof, then I could be as inefficient as I want to be with my own stuff. So maybe it's the terminology when we talk about, the grid electricity efficiency, or I'm not sure if it's even feasible for me to produce all what I need, but there's going to be a tipping point where we'll be able to be more self-sufficient without going to the grid, and that's a great thing. But I guess it comes back down to the role of what we're trying to ask.
Well, I think You're right. There is kind of the self-sufficient versus dependency on the grid. But the efficiency improvements also improve the lifespan of a lot of the utilities or units that we're using as well. So that actually feeds into some of the decarbonization methodology that a lot of agencies or groups are really looking for, because we want to also increase the lifespan of these units. Because if if we're fully self-sufficient and have our own solar panels or maybe even hydropower if you got a creek, your own creek nearby or something like that, and you don't need to depend on the grid, but you are going through appliances and you're going through the use of materials much more often than other people who are a little more efficient, your carbon footprint is a little bit higher than your neighbor. So there's still the lifestyle conversation we want to have with everybody on terms of efficiency of the use and being able to be a little more sustainable on materials that we're using as well. Does that help kind of answer your question on what we're trying to do?
That gets more into theory versus practicality. So the practicality is, if you don't need to go to the grid, that's something that's specific of you build renewable energy. And building renewable energy has lots of great things. And yes, there's a carbon footprint to build that the first time, all that. But that's an actionable, manageable thing of like, how much renewable self-supportive energy does the city for its own buildings as well as the community, and then you could have programs to help incentivize making that go faster, and that may be a bigger win than everyone like reducing their light usage by 5. It's something that, and the carbon footprint of all the things that wear out longer or shorter, I think, is too ethereal to be able to put math to. Where I was trying to get to a simpler, we have 2% of renewable energy, we get up to 20% that we control, then all of a sudden that's something you could actually build. That's all.
I would imagine, Stephen, that like the ICAP, in the actual ICAP, there are things like incentives for home builders to put in panels, do certain things that would want to incentivize that. That's probably most likely where it would be found, correct?
That's, yeah, for strategies on how to incentivize some of those.
So it wouldn't necessarily be here where it would be addressed.
Correct. Some of the guidance would be in the comprehensive plan in terms of like, or even the targets that you'll find in terms of what we're trying to achieve. But the specific strategies or incentives that we want to actually use are going to be identified in the ICAP.
Commissioner Samueta?
And I would think that there'll be some time before we would move away from the grid, of course, because you still need that redundancy if you move to renewable energy, especially for emergency services and whatnot. But I think from just hearing the other commissioners, I guess that clarity on, yes, reduce natural gas, and with the piece on electricity, we're probably moving more towards electrification, but the cleaner energy sources, basically, whether it's of course, solar panels or the battery storage and whatnot that developers could possibly use. Maybe a little bit more clarity on that, and that reduce, and even just add into the piece on the efficiency of utilizing what we have now and moving forward to push that efficiency. So a little bit more clarity on that text.
So I know in the ICAP, there is a lot more clarity, specifically with a lot of these policies, particularly how a lot of the policies were put together. If that's provided there in the functional plan, does the commission still want that better described in the policy in the comprehensive plan, or is it better fit in the functional plan?
So you're saying, right, it's in the functional plan right now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
More of those details are in the functional plan.
Okay. I may just add a word, the natural gas, because when I read that piece earlier, I was like, yes, natural gas, you want to reduce it. Yeah, 25% by 2030, and ultimately, of course, phase out of it. But when it said electricity, I think gentleman here actually caught that piece because we're not actually reducing electricity. We're actually we're increasing it. It's just making it cleaner, the source of that energy.
Okay, yeah.
So
we can
maybe
take a-
they just add the one word or phrase per se.
Commissioner Altamore.
Just hearing the discussion, I'm thinking about buildings that I was involved in building recently, and new construction, the gains are so significant. So I don't think it belongs in here, but I would imagine in the implementation plan, the gains that are achieved from new construction are going to be the bulk of it versus small incremental changes with current construction based on major rehabs or something like that. So I think that wouldn't live here in the goals, that would be in the implementation plan. Am I
Yes,
accurate
that's
there?
correct.
Okay, great. I know just the lighting in the HVAC systems alone can reduce a building's footprint by 56.
Commissioner Samota.
And that goes to the funding piece because you have the new builds and then you have the existing assets and infrastructure that would need to be renewed over time. And when an asset or building is up for replacement or for repair, that's where some of those new age ideas per se would take place, but there's probably going to need to be funding attached to that because especially early on it's going to be more expensive since it's not as prevalent in the industry or society right now.
Commissioner Krass.
This is actually fun. Some of the stuff is, we have a dichotomy of like two competing goals. We have reduced electricity at the same time of having more EV use, which is going to drive a lot more electricity need to supply cars, which those cars aren't buying gasoline anymore. So it comes down to only that one point we said reduce natural gas and electricity. But I think that may not be achievable if the move in the next 10 years is pretty hard to EVs. Then it's just going to increase our electrical use in the next, 10 years. That's all.
Commissioner Samota.
Yeah, maybe it's to reduce natural gas use and improve the efficiencies of electricity use or electrical use. And I think the key thing with moving to EV, electrical vehicles, is more so also the source of that energy, because electricity could be generated through cleaner means, and that's really the main goal. So as we go to electrification, we're going to be using more electricity per se than coal or natural gas, but the source of that electricity would be cleaner, reducing the carbon footprint.
Yeah, no, you're both absolutely correct. But I think with this policy, it's being more specific to the use within the building, so the operations of the building rather than the system-wide grid, where you're absolutely right. We're pushing for EV use more, which is going to be completely increasing EV need or the need for electricity. But for this policy focused on the buildings, that's really where it's looking at the efficiency of use within the buildings themselves.
Chair Voice, one quick question for you still, Stephen, building on what Commissioner Altamore and Commissioner Samota mentioned, is when the city does go to do retrofit, or is there some type of cost-benefit analysis? Because retrofits, as we've talked about before, can be very expensive. I mean, is there someone doing that type of work to make sure that we're not just spending an inordinate amount trying to retrofit a building that, again, it's one thing to change light bulbs or certain things, but to completely revamp maybe particularly this building, it could cost more than actually continually using it for the life of it and then knocking it down and starting again. Because again, Commissioner Altamore makes a good point. I'm just wondering, does that play in somewhere?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We're currently actually going through a facilities assessment for all city buildings and looking at what are the what's the future use of these buildings? What's going to be the needed retrofits and costs related to those retrofits to meet our internal climate goals for city buildings, as well as what would be the cost of completely reconstructing to now meet those climate goals.
Is that part of the story of what happened to our old city hall?
Oh, City Hall Northwest?
Yeah.
No, that one primarily was because of the COVID pandemic. We didn't have the need for a lot of the staff to be using the buildings, and so we consolidated staff use at the City Hall across the street. And so that has now led to the assessment of, do we need City Hall Northwest?
Okay, so less about climate change and resilience, more or less just don't need the office.
Well, so that is one of our oldest buildings that would need a lot of retrofits to make it a little more sustainable.
Commissioners, anything else? Commissioner Patterson?
I'll bite. I noticed that the natural disaster or climate emergency part mentions like wildfires and such. Just out of curiosity, where do like earthquakes land in this equation? Obviously, they're not climate related, but they are, I guess, natural disasters, and we are kind of in a high risk area for that. Are those addressed in any specific way in this element?
Specifically in the comprehensive plan, we're moving away from calling out specific strategies around each of the natural disasters, because the list can go on of how to address them. We're trying to address them within the city's own emergency management plan, as well as a more coordinated effort with the regional emergency management plan as well, where something like wildfires requires more of a regional coordination and strategy versus local within just city of Issaquah, because it's not, a fire is not going to just start and be isolated to Issaquah. It's going to be a broader impact. And so we want to have a more coordinated effort, which makes more sense in the county plan.
All right, any further questions for Stephen? Vice Chair Bader?
Yeah, it's just a comment I'm just thinking about, so I'll share it to make us sit here for 2 more minutes. On the whole conversation about energy use, there's like, again, going back to that environmental justice thing, there's a component of that I don't think is not addressed in the policy, but I think could become a risk, right? And so if we are prioritizing, and this mostly relates to housing, I think, versus like commercial buildings, but if we're prioritizing new builds, right? If we're not incentivizing retrofitting older buildings, right? That impact is going to continue to grow, right? Because who can afford the new versus what is the quality of the more affordable housing and the older housing here. And so there's just something that's like in my mind, I guess, that's like maybe it's worth stating, maybe it's not, that some of, I think, the conversation that we have risk, right? It's not that it's not worth doing, but it risks kind of exacerbating those disparate impacts.
And that's part of some of our disparate impact analysis that we're doing as part of the comprehensive plan, is to look at some of those risks. The market is completely going to control where a lot of this goes and when it happens, but the city can look at potential policies or strategies to address some of that, at least in the interim and even long term, as we're looking at our long-term housing strategies and how best to get even more affordable housing within the city. Looking around, there's not too many more comments. So I'm actually prod a little bit on thinking about some of the land use discussions that we had as a commission. What are some of the potential impacts you might see with what you read throughout this new element of would there be potentially strategies we need to consider on the business side in terms of how we want to get more jobs within the city, or even on the housing side? Is there something we should be considering as we're doing either our disparate impacts, or if we're looking through our housing strategies on how to get more affordable housing in different parts of the city?
Commissioner Altamore?
I think it was Commissioner Krass who already mentioned this to start, but right now the technology has not come along enough to make it as affordable to put in the higher efficiency pieces. So as many incentives, you mentioned going after those state grants, as many incentives as we can bring in, both for the businesses and for the housing development, is going to be really critical, because the payback does happen, but that payback is maybe 20, 25 years. And so if we can build that in sooner. I think about, in particular, a couple different properties that I manage, and we built one and had to VE out all of the high-efficiency HVAC, and now we are passing on those energy costs to very low-income residents versus other buildings where we had a little bit more flexibility and we were able to put in higher efficiency HVAC. So those components, I think, are really important for us to look at because it does disincentivize sometimes when it, at the end of the day, makes a much healthier building, but if you can't afford it when you're building it, what are you going to do? So the incentives, I think, are really key to this, not just requirements.
Commissioner Krass?
You open up a very good question, which is there any type of, like, you could look at, if you did these type of policies, what it adds to the cost per square foot or a build for new construction? And so then you get a scope of we've just added a hill for having more housing built. And it's not to say you shouldn't do those things, but at least you have a sense of, oh, it adds, 3% cost per square foot increase to do these. And then you could figure out other programs to try to offset. Whether it's dollars or whether it's some other, I think you mentioned, whether it's parking or maybe it's impervious services or whatever other tools you may have to make it more attractive. That was a very good example. You want to do that, but then cost. And even as a homeowner, the efficient ones, like if you have to replace your furnace, is going to be more expensive. Non-efficient one is ironic. Yes.
Commissioner Samweta?
Yeah, I think we're in agreement that these efficiencies or energy advancements will be more expensive in the short term, but there would be a return on investment in the long term. But that funding question still comes in, or even, and this may be a dirty word, the subsidize to be able to support some of those costs. And when you talk about strategies to be able to get developers or homeowners or even government entities to be able to push forward with these ideas and policies, there's going to need to be that help. And that could go into providing that help and funding these new ideas will also come with the catch of saying, hey, you need to provide this amount of affordable housing within your new development. That could be one of those strategies.
Stephen, how does the city intend to look at this once this is implemented along with the affordable housing strategy? Is something that's kind of a rolling, I know it's all kind of a rolling target, but I would imagine there's staff that'll begin looking, are we inducing our developers to build here when it might be too stringent to Commissioner Altimore's? How does the city intend to kind of check and balance these? Because they're all lofty goals. We want more affordable housing. We want to be a more efficient city. Sometimes they don't line up on the ledger book, though. How does the city intend to look at this?
Yeah, at the comprehensive plan level, we stay high level, we stay aspirational in terms of like, what do we want to achieve within the next 20 years? The how will be part of the commission's actual work plan in 2024 in terms of like what we'll be discussing of what incentives or programs or regulations should we be considering to get more affordable housing or to allow different types of development to come into the city. On your work plan for November, you're going to be discussing the Pioneer Project program, and that's one of those things to bring in new development. So what are some of those incentives that we want to provide to try to bring in that development? Is that incentives on different regulations? Is that incentives of what's being required of the developments? And that's part of the discussion of the commission.
Now we got more hands. Commissioner Altimore, I think I saw her first.
It's a race. So I was on a meeting today for a new affordable housing program, and there are 12 sources of funding, and all of their environmental standards are more stringent than that. And so it's I think that that's the balance when you're looking at these projects that have braided different funding sources that are coming into them, that you have to go, speaking specifically about affordable, the same thing wouldn't be true for private market, but you have to go with the most stringent when you're bringing those in. And so I don't see anything on this list that would be counter to the development of more affordable housing. And so these are all in line with what you would already have.
And the one thing to remember with the comp plan, being it's at the high level, it's what we're trying to achieve. The how is really built into our regulations, the land use code, the municipal code of what we're requiring from new development or new construction, or even rehab construction throughout the city. So that's where we get to the how, or in terms of how we're getting to some of these natural environment or addressing climate change goals and strategies that are called out in the Climate Action Plan.
Commissioner Krass?
And it just made me think that whether it's this comprehensive plan or any of them, there's always going to be conflicting goals between some of these different things. And we can't line them all up. It's just always going to be the case. If you want growth, but you also want to have safety or environmental or all these other things, there's going to be some potential conflicts. And then it goes back down to what you say is then the how and the prioritization, because you may not be able to do both immediately, but you may have to make a hard decision at one time or another. What's the most important thing at that? So it may just maybe like trying to make these things all work with other things. It's just an impossible task, and just realize that there's going to be some inherent conflict, and then the how gets you your priorities. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. There's always kind of a balancing act of what you're able to invest in and when, because we have limited staff, we have limited resources. The state funds aren't always coming, federal funds aren't always there, and our local dollars have to be balanced across multiple different priorities that we discuss as part of our annual budget process. So when it comes to a lot of the environmental, meeting of the environmental goals, we build it into different sections of how we're moving through those different priorities.
Commissioner Altsmore?
I would imagine this is already in the environmental plan and what they will do for their action plan, but the reality is the operating costs are so much lower that I think with some community education, like I struggle because I think we're past the point of compromising on these. I think we have to make the changes, which is why I was so happy to see the goals that were presented here. And so with that community education, to understand the benefits that you start seeing immediately as soon as you open that space or you retrofit that. So, and it does go to the cost benefit analysis that you mentioned, that there are some buildings that are not worth it to retrofit based on where they are. But I think that including in that action plan, that community education or that builder education, developer education about that would be really important, because you see it in the balance sheet really quick.
Stephen, would you like to prod anymore?
Well, I think my last question I'll prod with is, reading through these goals and policies for the new element, did you see any potential conflicts with what we've discussed on housing or land use, or even some of the other elements that you saw? As staff, we've tried to work through any potential conflicts, but you as commissioners and community members, you bring a different perspective that's helpful for a lot of this review. Not to put you on the spot for getting an answer tonight, but that's getting as part of this review process, that's also something we're looking for from you.
Always email Stephen. Stephen at Commissioner Kraft.
I think I started with, I was looking at less at conflict with other things and more about, are these achievable by the role of what the city can do? And I think we address some of those things. And that's, and I think we've already covered that. If you want us to take another scrub through and look at from a conflict standpoint, I'm happy to do that. But that was not my screen was more, okay, is this something we can actually do? And if not, should that be even in our charter or not? That was my first screen.
And a lot of the discussion in terms of what's achievable or what's not achievable, a lot of that, the sustainability staff or even our staff work with the environmental board, working through a lot of the implementation, particularly with the implementation of the climate action plan. when there's specific tasks that are related to the code or the comprehensive plan or any other kind of a responsibility of this commission, we bring that to this commission for discussion in terms of making a policy change or regulation change to support implementation of the climate action plan. So achievable is kind of dependent on the topic in terms of, you know, maybe it's not achievable today, but looking 20 years out into the future, that's something that's potentially achievable with the right amount of resources and investments.
Vice Chair Bader.
Yeah, to that question, to me, it's like, again, we can look at like individual elements, but it's hard, I think, to like answer that question looking at an element in a silo. I feel like the conflicts are more likely to come up across elements, and so I don't know if that's an exercise that staff might do to bring to us, but I think that could be helpful.
We, in the staff review, we try to resolve a lot of the conflicts before we bring it to the boards and commissions. But if there is something that we do see as a potential conflict, we usually pose it as kind of a policy question. And as you saw with your materials, we didn't really see anything. I mean, the climate action plan was a development over, you know, it was adopted 2 years ago, I believe. And it's been going through implementation. And so we've, you know, the staff have had the ability to start implementation and identify any potential conflict and work that into kind of proposed goals and policies update.
The other piece of this that's like hard for me to wrap my head around is like naming goals and policies without a vision. It just feels like reverse. And so there's potential, right, that all of this will conflict with the ultimate vision. And so I guess I don't know why there's not a vision, because assuming there's like some sort of unspoken vision that all of this is working towards.
Yeah.
But
No, that's our mistake of not including in the memo. There is a vision where we're using from the climate action plan. That'll be
because I
supporting
thought it
this element.
specifically said like there is no vision, or the vision is coming later. Or something
Yeah,
like that.
there's no vision in this material. But there we are using the vision from the climate action plan for this element.
I thought you guys were just building the speech, body out first. Okay, Chair Voice, I guess for the last thing for me is, again, to Commissioner Krass's point, Stephen, I didn't really look for conflict. I think there's one or two redundancies. I think there are things that, I think, for example, like the multimodal, I mean, to me, that kind of ties in with public safety. Like, as long as the city's doing a good job with that, I think so I think there's things that are outside of the land use element the city has to consider. Right, so, again, to your point, yeah, you guys did a great job. It seems like a pretty clean sheet. Even a couple areas where you guys consolidated stuff. So I didn't really see conflict myself.
And we appreciate hearing that as well.
Who wants to create conflict? Vice Chair Bader.
I think in the housing element, the King County had a bunch of policies. Does King County have similar policies for the other elements?
Yes, but it's there's not as much as with the housing and county policies.
All right, well, one last time. Anyone would like to add anything to Stephen's presentation? Okay, well, thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Yeah, great discussion, everyone. And that was our only regular business item this evening, so we're going to move into reports. City Council updates. Are there any updates, Stephen?
Chair Voice, since I updated last week, there has not been any new updates.
Okay. Other business and announcements. I'm sure you'd like to tell us a little bit about this joint meeting we're going to have.
I would. Thank you, Chair. So our next meeting is November 9th. The Commission will be reviewing the Capital Transportation Utilities element. Thomas Valdrez with the Senior Transportation Planner will be joining us that evening to talk about those three elements. And then on November 15th, we're looking to do a joint meeting with the Economic Vitality Commission, where the location is still being determined, but more details about that will be coming. But the host of that meeting will be the Economic Vitality Commission, so Planning Policy Commission will be guest. But the main topic will be the Pioneer Project Program. And how the city should potentially approach such a program and get both commissions' feedback on any negatives or positives with different approaches.
Thank you. I hope everybody can make it on the 9th and the 15th. Any other business announcements, Stephen?
None from staff at this time.
Okay, thank you. Any final words from our commissioners? All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you all bundle up. It's pretty cold out there. We'll adjourn this meeting tonight at 7:28 p.m. Thanks, everyone.